All right, so I'll say good morning. Let's begin by thanking our sponsors, our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Sivan, Naftoli and Chava Tilson from Eretz Yisroel. With gratitude to Naftoli's Chaver Benjamin Wohl for introducing him to the Daf Yomi. May Hashem bless us all to finish the Daf Yomi cycle together and celebrate with a siyum together in Eretz Yisroel. Amen. To thank Baruch Meir and Rena Dubin for dedicating all the shiur and drashos this month. In this chus, may Hashem continue to protect our brothers and sisters in Eretz Yisroel. May all of our children remain safe and complete their year of learning with a deep connection to the land and to Hashem's Torah. Well, so with that, let us begin. So we have an exciting daf ahead of us today, and hopefully also the ability to close out the sugya that we began on Sunday in Eretz Hashem and have not yet resolved. But let's pick up. Today's daf is Nun Aleph 51. We are picking up on Nun Amud Beis. We kind of left off right in the middle of the brisa. I apologize for that. So let's pick up in the middle of the brisa. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11 lines up on the bottom. Amar Rav Sheshas. So we're just jumping right into the middle here. So Rav Sheshas says, remember from yesterday, Lo, Rav Sheshas says, when interpreting the brisa is not referring to the par, rather be'elo shel Aaron. The brisa is referring ultimately again to the ayil, to the ram of Aaron. Hachanami mistabra. This would appear to be clear. Because ultimately, if you assume that the brisa that we were discussing yesterday refers to the par of the Kohen Gadol, Tumura dipar Shabbos v'tamo hudul al-dachya. So we'll say that seems to infer that the only problem with the Tmura of the par is that ultimately it's not Docha, Shabbos, and Tumah. But would you even be able to offer this up? Ha Tmuras Chatasi. This would be the Tmura of a Chatos, Utmuras Chatos Lemisa Azla. And Tmuras Chatos ultimately again is left to die. To which the Gemara says, you're right though, the Olam Paro. You're right, the Bryce is talking about the par of the Kohen Gadol. Umay Temura. So this is very interesting. What does it mean when it says Temura? Shem Temura. It means the general category of Temura. In other words, that the Brisa is not per se focusing on a particular case of Temura. Rather, again, the Brisa is talking about the category of Temura. If you take a look at Rashi says, My Temura, about 8 lines up, 9 lines up from the bottom. My Temura, Shem Temura. Li'olam Bepar. In reality, the brisa that we were discussing is talking about the power of the Kohen Gadol. V'hai chomer bezevach mi betruma. I'm sorry, I keep saying Temura, and the chumra that zevach has over Temura is in the category diktani lav at Temura didei koi elahachi kamar chomer bezevach mi shem Temura shein lechadavar sheshmo Temura docha Shabbos v'afila Temuras krevos. So we'll say, interestingly enough, what the Gemara means to say is like this. It is a chumrah that a regular carbon has over the general category of Temura, but lav dafka every particular situation. Ihachi zevach nami shem zevach. If that's the case, why not interpret the brisa as referring not to a particular carbon, but the general category of karbanos? To which the Gemara says, Shem zevach lo katani. The Gemara is saying we're not going to talk about a general category of karbanos, and I'll tell you why. Mimai. Mediktani chomer bitmura shatmura chala al balmum kavua ve'ina yotzi lechulin ligazes v'le'avid. If you remember again, one of the chumras that the Gemara espoused regarding Temura is that Temura has the ability to be chalal al balmum. So we discussed this yesterday. If you go ahead and you take an inherently blemished animal and you try to make that animal into a carbon, the sacrificial designation does not devolve on an animal that cannot be sacrificed. That's different than Temura, right? Interestingly enough, if you exchange a carbon for a blemished animal, that blemished animal actually can become a Temura. Now again, obviously you can't offer it up, but Lamaise it does become a Temura. To which the Gemara says, and if ultimately again you think that what does Zevach refer to, Shem Zevach, then that statement doesn't hold up, because after all, Va'ika top of Nun Aleph, Va'ika Bechar Umaiser Decholin Al Balmum Kavua. So if you want to understand, the Gemara said that the Chumrah that ultimately Temura has over a regular carbon is that halacha l'maisa Temura is chal on a balmum, and ultimately again never can be redeemed to become chulin or to be shorn, or to be worked. And if you hold that halacha l'maisa zevach doesn't mean a particular carbon, but rather it means the general category of carbonos, that statement is incorrect. Why is the statement incorrect? Because there are examples of carbonos, regular carbonos that you could do this with. For example, which carbon on top of nun aleph? Bechar umaiser. Both say the good example is bechar and maiser behema, because after all, these animals, the cholin al bal mum kavua. Both say these animals ultimately again can be chal on a bal mum kavua, right? Ultimately, a bechar animal is a de facto designation, and meiser behema can also be chal on a bal mum kavua. Ve'ein yotzin lechulin legazes v'le'avid, and they do not go out to chulin; they cannot be redeemed. Ultimately, again for shearing or for working. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says bechar kidushasa merechem. Firstborn animal, again, its kedusha is in utero. Bein tam, bein bal mum. Whether that animal is a tam or a bal mum, ve'ein lo shum pidyon, and it has no redemption. Dichsiv bei ach bechar shar lo sifta u'maiser beheminami ksiv lo yivaker beitov l'ra al machala bal mum u'pidyon ein lo. So the Gemara is just pointing out over here, there are examples of zevach. There are examples of zevach that ultimately are chal al bal mum also. There are also examples of zevach that cannot be redeemed for the purposes of going out to chulin, for working and for shearing. Ella shem zevach lo katani. Rather, we'll say, therefore, you must say that the brisa is not referring to the general category of karbanos, but rather to specific karbanos. Umayshna temura. And ultimately, again, so why is temura different? That we can interpret the brisa as referring to a general category of temura, shem temura achasi. So ultimately, again, I will say because there is really only one general category of temura. However, zevach ika bachar v'ika meiser. But ultimately, again, when it comes to zevach, when it comes to stam karbanos, we see that there is a division. There are regular karbanos, but now, as we just pointed out, bachar and meiser are treated fundamentally different. Good. According to Rav Sheshes, ad mokim le be'elo shalarun lukma bePesach. So it's according to Rav Sheshes, instead of going ahead and setting up the brisa as talking about the ayil of Aaron, why not go ahead and set up? So all just the continuation of yesterday's brisa. Why not go ahead and set it up as dealing with Karban Pesach? The docha es haShabbos ve'es hatoma va'oset tmura. As we'll say, after all, Karban Pesach seems to have alamailas as well. Number one, it's docha Shabbos. Number two, it's docha tumah, although we normally group those two things together. Oset temura, you could affect the temura ultimately through Karban Pesach, and ultimately, again, the Karban Yachidi, and it's a Karban Yachid. Well, it's the same thing. In order, it's able, we saw this yesterday, that in order to be able to go ahead and affect temura, what has to happen? You have to be a Karban Yachid, right? Even Karban Sibor, even Karban Shal Shutfim cannot go ahead and affect temura. To which the Gemara says he's not going to set it up as Karban Pesach. Why? Kasavar ein shochtin Pesach al hayachid. So this is very interesting. Apparently, Rav Sheshes holds that you would not go ahead and shech the Karban Pesach for an individual. But I say this harkens back to our Psachim days. If you take a look at Rashi, Kasavar ein shochtin Pesach al hayachid. K'Rab Yehuda da Amrachim Meseches Psachim v'yaliflei mibelo sucha lizboach has Pesach be'echad. V'chivan de'ina is really the pasuk is lo sucha lizboach has Pesach be'echad sha'arecha. Right, that's really what it means. That you can't shech Karban Pesach in your backyard. You can only shech Karban Pesach in the precincts of the Beis Hamikdash. But the drasha that's made is lo sucha lizboach has Pesach be'echad. You cannot shech the Karban Pesach for one individual. The chayvan de'ino ba below shutfus enos in temura. So everyone says very interesting. Rav Shesh's view of Karban Pesach is that since Karban Pesach cannot be brought for an individual, can only be brought as part of a group. Therefore, what? It has the status of a carbon of shutfim, right, of partners, and because it is a partnership carbon, therefore what? It is not subject to temura. For size, it says the Gemara, the nokme be Pesach Sheni. Why don't you go ahead and then set it up maybe as Pesach Sheni? So I'll say, so again, remember Pesach Sheni can be brought for an individual, because remember again, by definition, who brings Pesach Sheni? Who brings Pesach Sheni? Someone who was Tamei or B'derech HaChoka. That's not a communal thing. I mean, it can be a communal... No, it's not a communal thing. Because they'll say, what happens if the community is Tamei? you bring Pesach Rishon. So obviously, again, Pesach Sheni is brought ultimately by a Yachid. So why not Pesach as Pesach Sheni? We'll say this is very interesting. To which the Gemara says, Mi dachi tuma. Tell me, is Pesach Sheni dochet tuma? So we're going to discuss this actually in a bit of depth in just a moment, which is we saw this in Pesachim. The Gemara says that ultimately, again, Pesach Sheni is not dochet tuma. Both say, what's the logic to say that Pesach Sheni is not dochet tuma? The whole reason you bring Karban Pesach Sheni is why? Because you were tamei. So the Gemara says, does it make sense then to go and offer a Pesach Sheni b'tumah? So therefore the Gemara suggests that ultimately, again, Rav Sheshes, the Gemara is asking, why does Rav Sheshes have to set up the braysos talking about the Ayil of Aaron? Why doesn't he choose a different Karban, like Karban Pesach, to illustrate all of the facts or all of the statements that the brayso wants to make? To which the Gemara says, because Rav Sheshes holds, number one, Karban Pesach cannot be offered up as for a Yachid. Therefore, it's not a Karban Yachid, it's a Karban HaShutfim. If it's a Karban HaShutfim, it's not subject to Me'ilah. What about Pesach Sheni? Pesach Sheni is not Docha Tumah. And in the Brisa, we were trying to find an example of a regular Karban that's Docha Shabbos, Docha Tumah, and ultimately can affect Tmura. Well, according to Rav Sheshes, Karban Pesach does not go ahead and satisfy those criteria. Amar Rafuna B'Rav Yoshua Rabba Vitana Maishna Pesach the Karle Karban Yachid Umaishna Chagiga the Karle Karban Sibar. So Rabbi said this is very interesting. If we go back to the Brisa yesterday, right? You go back to the Brisa yesterday, the Brisa that spoke about again that the chumras that Tmura has over Zevach and Zevach has over Tmura. So the Gemara called Karban Pesach a Karban Yachid and called Karban Chagiga a Karban Tzibur. Now I will say, so just to be clear, right, both of those Karbanos, Chagiga and Karban Pesach, are Karbanos which are consumed by individuals, or by groups, right, but by individuals. So why does the Gemara make a distinction between Karban Pesach and Karban Yachid, Karban Pesach and Karban Tzibur? To which the Gemara says, Imishum da'asi biknufya. So maybe you'll say Karban Chagiga is called a Karban Tzibur, not as much because the Karban itself is brought on behalf of the collective, but rather because the Karban is brought in a great assembly. Others also remember again, when do you bring Karban Chagiga? Karban Chagiga is brought, halach l'maaseh, during the Yomim Tovim. What happens during the Regalim in the Beis HaMikdash? The Beis HaMikdash is packed. So because it's packed, because it's brought b'kinufya, a large gathering, so perhaps ultimately again, that is what makes it a Karban Tzibur. To which the Gemara says, Pesach nami asi b'kinufya. Karban Pesach is also brought in a large gathering. Also remember again, we saw this in incredible detail in Maseches Pesachim, right? The idea that when Karban Pesach was brought, ultimately, again, there were throngs of people. The Kohanim were up to their knees in blood. So it can't be that Karban Chagiga is called a Karban Tzibur, because halacha l'maisa is brought with a group of people, and yet, Karban Chagiga is brought with a group of people, and yet Karban Pesach is not, because Karban Pesach is also brought b'knufya, to which the Gemara says, Isa Pesach Sheni, Delo Asi b'knufya. Here's the problem. There's Pesach Sheni, and Pesach Sheni is not brought with a large assembly of people. So also what the Gemara is pointing out over something really quite fascinating, which is that halacha l'maisa, when we speak about Karban Pesach, or when the Brisa speaks about Karban Pesach by definition includes Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni, which is really quite fascinating because generally, when we discuss, in Gemara, when we discuss Karban Pesach or Pesach, we're almost always only discussing Pesach Rishon, not Pesach Sheni. Yet amazingly enough, here in the Brisa, the Gemara explains that Pesach means Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni. Therefore, even if you wanted a taina that Pesach Rishon should have the status of a Karban Tzibur, Pesach Sheni does not. Pesach Sheni does not. For the simple reason that Pesach Sheni is really the purview of individuals. So Amrlei, Im Kain, Yehi Dochas HaShabbos V'Esatoma. If that's the case, then ultimately again Pesach Sheni should be Dochas Shabbos and Tumah. That I will say, I want to point something out. Pesach Sheni is Dochas Shabbos. Really what the Gemara means over here is that Pesach Sheni should be Dochas Tumah. This is looping back now to the previous discussion we were just engaging in about does Pesach Sheni or is Pesach Sheni docha tuma or not. So the Gemara says Amar lei in kimanda amar dochi. Yeah, this is a machlokes, and we're recording ourselves over here with the opinion that says that Pesach Sheni is docha tuma. But here we go. This is such a fascinating machlokes. The Sanya Pesach Sheni docha Shabbos zena docha atuma. But say Tanakama says Pesach Sheni is docha Shabbos, but it's not docha tuma. It's not docha tuma. Rabbi Yehuda Omer af docha atuma. Rabbi Yehuda says no, it's even docha tuma. So we'll say fundamental machlokes by Pesach Sheni. Tana, everyone agreeing that Pesach Sheni is docha Shabbos. Everyone agrees with. Machlokes is Pesach Sheni docha tuma. Tanakama, no. Rabbi Yehuda, yes. My time with the Tanakama. We'll say, why is it that halacha l'maisa the Tanakama says that it's not docha tuma? So Tanakama will say very simply, Amar l'cha mipnei tuma dachisu v'yaseh b'tuma. So we'll say, listen to this Tanakama says, I don't understand. The whole reason we didn't let this guy do Pesach Rishon was why? He was Tameh. So now, you told him, don't do Pesach Rishon because you're Tameh. And now we're going to let him do Pesach Sheni because he's Tameh? It's totally counterintuitive. Pesach Sheni is there to allow for someone who couldn't do Pesach Rishon because he was Tameh. So therefore, by definition, the only way to go out and do Pesach Sheni is what? Is if you're Tar. What happens if you're Tameh? What happens if you're Tameh? There's always next year, right? That's what happens if you're Tameh by Pesach Sheni. However, Rabbi Yehuda, so it says the Tanakama. Rabbi Yehuda will say, Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Lacha, Amar Kra, Kechol Chukas HaPesach Ya'asu Oso. Listen to this. Va'afilu Bituma. We'll say, listen to this. Rabbi Yehuda makes a drasha. When the Torah speaks about Pesach Sheni, the Torah says, Kechol Chukas HaPesach Ya'asu Oso. Pesach Sheni should be conducted in accordance with all of the rules of Pesach Rishon. All of the rules which govern Pesach Rishon should govern Pesach Sheni. We'll say, can Pesach Rishon ultimately again be brought B'tumah? Well, under certain circumstances, yes. So therefore, again, there's also an allowance to bring Pesach Sheni B'tumah as well. What's the allowance to bring Pesach Sheni B'tumah? If you're Tameh, right? If you're Tameh and there's no other way for you to bring it, you could bring Pesach Sheni B'tumah. HaTorah hechzir lav lasos b'tara. The Torah tries to get you to bring Pesach Sheni B'tara, but ultimately, again, lo zacha ya'asena b'tumah. If you are unable to bring your Pesach Rishon, your Pesach Sheni B'tara, then ultimately, again, you should go ahead and bring it B'tumah. Says the Gemara Amud Beis, V'seifok lei, da'asher lo amrachmana, mishalahu mevi. So I'll say, so again, I just want to stop here for just a moment. So the Gemara now is going to jump back to a previous part of the conversation. So I'll say, so again, by the way, how do we paskin at Pesach Sheni? We paskin like the Tanakama. That Pesach Sheni is docha Shabbos, Pesach Sheni is not docha Tuma. So the mice again, if we'll call him Ruvain, if Ruvain missed Pesach Rishon because he was Tameh, and now comes to Pesach Sheni and he's Tameh again, we say sorry. Right? Better luck next time, Emir Hashem. But ultimately, again, we do not allow Pesach Sheni to be offered up in a state of Tumah. Fine. So it says the Gemara, I be seifok lei. Da'asher lo amarachmana mishalahu maybe. Supposed to listen to this. So take a look at the top Rashi. V'seifok lei Amud Beis. Baya de Rabbi Elazar de Lael. The Par Yom Kippurim de Kohanim bekuf Yehu de Miskapri Bey. To ha'asher lo ksiv Bey. Tlasa zimni. Limeute tzibor ve'achav ha'kohanim. D'lo medido asi. Tlasa asher lo ksivi Bey. Betray Kroy v'hikriv Aaron. V'hikriv Tinyana. V'shachatu as parachatas Hashem. Supposed to listen to this. So we'll say, if you remember again, one of the fundamental discussions that we have two open questions, right? What are two fundamental open questions? Well, the first question I will say is the question we still have open from them Tes Amud Beis. Remember again, what was that question? No one used the weekend for Chazara. Mamish. Okay, so we'll say, so again, remember the dam of the par. Right, so remember again, the Kohen shechted the par, Kohen Gadol shechted the par, then have the dam, Kohen Gadol died. So remember again, what was the Shaila? Can the new Kohen come along and use that dam? What was that machlokes? So that's a machlokes. What is it based on? Is dam ikri par. right? Is dam called dam or is dam called par? Right? When we look at the dam, what do we see? The pasuk says, "Bezos yava Aaron ala kodesh bepar." Aaron has to come into the kodesh with the par. Does par mean a par that he shechted, or par just means the dam of the par? The nafkamina would be: does the second kohen gadol have to shecht a new par? That's open question number one. In yesterday's daf, we opened up another question, which is what? What's the status of the par? Remember, Gibel say three options. What's the status of the par? Good. Either carbon yachid, carbon sibor, or shutfus. Right? Those are the three options when it comes to the par of the kohen gadol. So the Gemara says, now we're focusing on that question. The identity of the par. Carbon yachid, carbon sibor, carbon shutfin. Says the Gemara, Seifuklei, why don't you prove that the par is clearly a carbon yachid? Because the pasuk says da'asher lo amar rachmana. Right? The pasuk says v'hikriv Aaron es parachatas asher lo. The pasuk says Aaron will offer up his par, and the Gemara darshans mishalohu maybe. The Rabbi say who pays for the par? Who pays for the par? The kohen gadol. The par must come from the kohen gadol's own money. This anya, because we learned asher lo, the part that belongs to him, mishalohu maybe v'lo mishal tzibor. That Allah will say the money for the par must come from the kohen gadol's pocket and not from communal coffers. Yachol lo yavi mishal tzibor she'ena tzibor miskaprin bo. So you might have thought, well, the reason that tzibor doesn't pay for the par is very simple, because the tzibor does not gain kapara through the par. Aval yavi mishal echav hakohanim shari echav hakohanim miskaprin bo. But maybe again, it can be bought from Kohanic money. You know, we'll say, so maybe it makes sense that the par is not paid for with communal money because there is no communal kapara through the par. But maybe because the Kohanim do get kapara through the par, maybe the Kohanim should chip in for the par. Talmud lomar asher lo. Therefore, the pasuk says asher lo, that belongs to him. That alocha l'maisa, the money for the par must come from the kohen gadol. Yachol lo yavi v'im hevi kasher. So you might have thought, although the kohen gadol is not supposed to bring the par from other funds, either community funds or kohanic funds, meaning other kohanim's funds, that he shouldn't. But if he did it, the par is still kasher. Talmud lomar shuv asher lo. So therefore, the pasuk says another time asher lo. That's v'hikriv Aaron es parachatos asher lo. Shina hakosov alav la'akev. Ultimately, again, the Torah goes out of its way to say asher lo la'akev. We'll say la'akev means that this is an immutable part of the par. Namely, that Allah l'maisa, the par must come from the kohen gadol's private funds, and if it comes from any form of communal funds, whether it's tzibor funds or kohanic funds, the par is invalid. Now, we'll say, what kind of picture does this paint? According to this, what type of carbon is the par? A carbon yachid, right? Bipashtos, if we're so insistent that it has to come from the Kohen's money, bipashtos, that makes it a carbon yachid. Ulatamech, and according to this logic, echav hakohanim, ilav dukanu b'gvia heichim echaperlu. So I will say, see here we keep coming back to this tension. Here's the great anomaly by the par. On one hand, you're telling me the Torah goes out of its way twice to say asher lo. Over and over the Torah is saying the par must come from the money of the kohen gadol. Yet I will say we know explicitly who achieves atonement through the par. Who achieves atonement? The Kohanim. The Kohanim. Both say, remember again. So on one hand, you're telling me that it can only come from the money of the kohen gadol, right? No one else is allowed to pay for it, and if anyone else does pay for it, in fact, that compromises the par, which again seems to paint a picture of a carbon yachid. But on the flip side, it's clear, it's a pasuk in the Torah that the Kohanim achieve kapara through this par. So what's going on over here? So the Gemara says, according to this logic, Echav Kohanim ilav dukanu b'gevia heichim echaperlu. So I said, this is an incredible yisod. The Gemara understands that in order to go ahead and achieve kapara, so what do the Kohanim need? What do they need? What do they need? Ownership. But let's say it's an incredible yisod in life that ultimately, again, if you want the kapara of Klal Yisrael, you must be invested in Klal Yisrael. As I say, there's no such thing as benefiting from something as a bystander. If you want the true impact of anything in life, you want the true impact of your mishpacha, be involved in your mishpacha. You want the true impact of being a member of Klal Yisrael, you have to be involved in Klal Yisrael. There is no such thing as kapara, there is no such thing as gaining atonement while standing on the sidelines. It doesn't happen that way. So the Gemara says, if the Kohanim are getting kapara through this carbon, then by definition they must somehow be sacrificially vested. There must be some level of ownership here. To which the Gemara says, if the Kohanim do not own some part of this, how do they achieve kapara? Ella, we'll say this is absolutely riveting. Ella shiny be Gaza da'aron, da'afkare rachmana gabe echav ha-kohanim. So we'll say, get ready for this statement. It's absolutely mind-blowing. Rather, what happens? We'll say, the ownership of the Kohanim is a little bit different. Or I should say, the ownership of Aaron is a little bit different vis-a-vis this par. Da'afkare rachmana gabe echav. What did HaKadosh Baruch Hu do, Rabbi say? Who owns the par? Who owns the par? Who owns the par? Kohen Gadol. How do you know the Kohen Gadol owns the par? Because he pays for it. Right? Rabbi say, incredible yisod. He who pays owns. Klal Gadol in life. He who pays owns. So it is clear that the Kohen Gadol owns the par. But how do the Kohanim achieve kapara if at the end of the day they have no financial interest in the par? To which the Gemara says something mind-blowing. Da'afkare rachmana gabe echav ha-kohanim. Both say, what does the Ribono Shel Olam do? He takes Aaron's complete ownership of the par and he's mafkir it. He makes part of it hefker and conveys partial ownership of the par to the Kohanim. So I will say, whereas every single other carbon, ultimately, again, financial ownership determines, or the financial interest determines ownership. The par, which is exclusively the financial ownership of the Kohen Gadol, the Ribono Shel Olam himself is mafkir part of the Kohen Gadol's ownership and conveys that ownership interest to the Kohanim themselves. Therefore, again, the Gemara says, "Hachagabi Tmura Nami Shiny Begaza de Aaron Da'afkir Rachmana Gabe Echav HaKohanim." Both say, therefore, again, let's close out Tmura. So, based on this, can you go ahead and perform Tmura on the power of the Kohen Gadol? What would you say? Can you perform Tmura? Both say, be brave. Answer. It's good to take a stand on things. Right? Can you go ahead and perform Tmura on the power of the Kohen Gadol? Everybody's avoiding eye contact with me now. Excellent, good. Let's say, don't be scared. Right? The answer is no. Why not? Because it's a partial shutfin. Because ultimately, again, there's joint ownership. So we'll say, so again, remember everything now, by the way, I'm going to show you something incredibly beautiful. Everything, with this one statement, all of our open questions kind of fall into place. So let's work backwards. So now, first of all, we understand the complex nature of the par. The par itself, this is the power of the Kohen Gadol, which could only be purchased with the money of who? Kohen Gadol. What happens if he uses someone else's money? It's invalid, right? The carbon itself is not valid. So Allah Chamaisa could only be purchased with the money of the Kohen Gadol. Lest you think, therefore, that it transforms it into a carbon yachid, something amazing is happening over here. So you'll say, you ask yourself, where does the Gemara get this idea that the Ribono Shel Olam is mafkir, right? He makes hefker part of the ownership interest of the Kohen Gadol and gives it over to the Kohanim. Where does the Gemara get that from? So I will say, it's based on the fact that we have to back into a reality. What's the reality? The Torah tells us, v'chiper ba'ado ba'ad kol beiso. Right? The Torah tells us that the par atones for the Kohanim. So we know that is a divine fact. The par atones for the Kohanim. Once I know that fact, that's a fact, I now have to figure out the mechanics. So here are the facts I have. Fact number one is that the par atones for the Kohen Gadol and the Kohanim. Fact number two is that the par can only be purchased with the money of the Kohen Gadol. So I have two facts that, if you think about it, are a little bit mutually exclusive. Because fact number one tells me joint ownership, right? Which is that it atones for the Kohen Gadol and Kohanim. Fact number two, which has purchased the money of the Kohen Gadol, makes it a carbon yachid. So how do I reconcile fact one and fact two? That's what the Gemara says. Afkare rachmana gabe echav hakohanim. It must be that the mechanics of the par is that the Ribono Shel Olam was mafkir, some of Aaron's ownership interest, and conveyed that over to the Kohanim, making this a jointly owned karban, thereby allowing the Kohen Gadol and the Kohanim to achieve atonement through the par, and also telling me what? That you cannot affect Temura with the par. Why not? Why not? Because halacha l'maisa, it is a karban shel shutfin, and only an individual owned, only a karban shel yachid is subject to tzmura. Anything that has more than one owner, by definition, not subject to tzmura. I will say so. But what about our last outstanding question? What about? Remember again how this all started. Kohen Gadol shechted the par. He has the dam. Then what happened? He died. Kohen Gadol number 2 comes on the scene. Now what's the shaila? Can he use the dam from the first Kohen Gadol's par, or must he go ahead and offer up a new par? So we'll say, so now watch this. So the Rambam, by the way, you already know the answer to this. What's the answer? Take a guess. What's the answer? Okay, I'll read to you in the Rambam. So listen to this. So Hilchos Avodas Yom Kippurim, Parakei Halacha Yud Gimel. Par Yom Kippurim. I will say, here it is. Here the Rambam spells this all out. Hey Yud Gimel. Par Yom Kippurim. Apa Pishe Kohen Gadol Kona Mishalo. Shnemar Parachatos Asherlo. Hamokom Hifkir Mamono Bo L'chol Echav HaKohanim. Both say, so here it is explicitly in the Rambam. Even though the Kohen Gadol must go ahead and purchase the par with his own money, the Ribono Shel Olam was mafkir, right? Made hefker, some of the ownership interest of the Kohen Gadol, and conveyed it to the other Kohanim. Listen to this. She'ilu lo haya lahen bo shutfus, lo haya miskaprin bo. For the simple fact, says the Rambam, because if the Kohanim did not have an ownership interest in this, then what? There is no kapara. See, Rabbi say, you cannot glean the full impact or full effect of something if you are not vested. If you're just a spectator, if you're just a bystander, you cannot, it doesn't matter, community, kehila, family, whatever it is, if you're involved in something, actively vested in something, you've put in your money, you've put in your resources, you put in yourself, then you could glean the benefits of it. Says the Gemara, if they're not a shutuf, you can't get kapara. Lefichach, I will say, here we go. That the Rambam adds an additional case over here. Let's say the Kohen Gadol bought the par and he died before Shchita. So what's the halacha? HaKohen Shom Itaktov Eino Mevi Par Acher Elo Shochid Es Harishon. The replacement Kohen Gadol goes ahead and brings the first par. Why? Because they all own it b'shutfus. Even though again it was bought with the Kohen Gadol's money, nevertheless Kadosh Baruch Hu was mafkir, an ownership chelik, and gave it to all the other Kohanim. Ve'eno chato shemesu ba'aleh shetal mushfain. So, however, here we go. Shachar es apar umeis kodem shechaber b'damo. So we'll see what happens if the Kohen Gadol shechted his par, has the dam, but then died before being able to sprinkle the blood. What's the halacha? HaKohen ha'acher nichnas b'dam zeh umechaper bo. We'll say it all makes sense. Then halacha l'maisa, Kohen Gadol number 2 could use the blood from the now deceased Kohen Gadol's par. And I will say it all makes sense. Why? Because again it's shufus. Because ultimately the par of the Kohen Gadol is considered to be owned in partnership. Therefore, halacha l'maisa both say, again, if the Kohen Gadol bought the par, died before being able to shecht it, the replacing Kohen Gadol could still use that par because they're all considered to be owners in that par. If the Kohen Gadol shechted the par but didn't yet get a chance to sprinkle the dam, the replacing Kohen Gadol could go ahead and use that dam. Because they're all considered to be shutfim in that par. And what are the mechanics of that? Even though the Kohen Gadol bought it with his own money, the Ribono Shel Olam was mafkir, a chelik of the ownership interest from the Kohen Gadol, and ultimately again conveyed it to the regular Kohanim. Absolutely incredible. We'll say that closes out our sugya. Now back to the Avod of Yom Kippur, back to our journey through the Beis Hamikdash. Hayim mahalech beheichol. Ad shemagia lebein shtei haparoches. So we'll say hamavdil bein kodesh ubein kodesh kodesh. So we'll say. So now remember again, the last thing we left off with was that the Kohen Gadol has in his hand. What does he have in his hand? He has in his right hand. What does he have? The shovel, right, with the coals. In his left hand, he has the ladle. You remember again, we spoke about what the Kohen Gadol does with the ladle inside the Kodesh HaKadoshim, but again, that was jumping ahead, right? If we keep to the orders of the Mishnayos, The last piece in the Mishnah we had is that the Kohen Gadol is walking in with the machta, with the shovel in his right hand, the ladle, the kaf, in his left hand, and he's walking in. This Mishnah, and also, where is he walking to? Where is he walking to? The Kodesh HaKadosh. Because remember again, the Ketoris service. Remember again, on Yom Kippur, I will say, how many forms of Ketoris are we offering up? We're offering up Ketoris 3 times. How many types of Ketoris? 2 types. Right? Because remember again, there's the daily Ketoris, right? Part of which is offered up morning and afternoon. That's offered up, remember, where? Mizbeach HaPanimi, the inside golden altar. And then there is the Ketoris of Yom Kippur, which is offered up where? In the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So we're focused now on the Ketoris of Yom Kippur. So he's walking into the Kohen Gadol is walking into the Mikdash with again the Machta in the right hand, the Kaf in the left hand. The Mishnah is now going to discuss where he's walking to, or how he's going to travel. So he would walk in the Beis HaMikdash. Now we'll say Heichal, of course. Again, if you happen to have your Beis HaMikdash diagram, there are more available up here as well. So remember again, the Kohen Gadol now is walking into the Heichal. This is called the Heichal over here, right? The actual, when we talk about the Beis HaMikdash, we often refer to this entire area. The Kohen Gadol now is entering into the Heichal. He's going to go through the Ulam, ultimately go into the Kodesh. So watch this. Says the Gemara, Mahalech beHeichal, Ad shemagia belebein shtei haparoches, hamavdilos bein hakodesh ubein kodesh hakadoshim ubeinehem ama. So we'll say, listen to this. And he's going to walk until he gets, so we'll say, if you notice on this picture over here, it says you walk into the Kodesh, there are 2 squiggly lines over here. Those lines are supposed to represent 2 curtains. The Tanakhama says that there were 2 curtains which divided between the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and there was 1 amma of space in between those 2 curtains. 1 amma, not a lot of space, right? 1.5 feet in between those 2 curtains. So he would go ahead and he would walk up to those 2 curtains and then go in between the curtains. So the Gemara says, Am Rabbi Yossi. I'm sorry, Rabbi Yossi Omer, Lo Haisa Sham Ela Paroches Achas Bilvad. Rabbi Yossi disagrees. Rabbi Yossi holds that no, there were not 2 curtains, there was only 1 curtain. 1 curtain dividing between the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKadoshim, Shnei Amar, Vehevdila HaParoches, because Rabbi Yossi says, the pasuk only says, the parochas, singular, the curtain, singular, will go ahead and divide between the Kodesh and the Kodesh Kodeshim. So we'll say, so here's what the Mishnah is telling me. The Mishnah is very nondescript on how the Kohen is walking in. We'll get into greater detail down in the Gemara, but the Mishnah does bring up a fundamental machlokes. How many curtains were there in the Beis HaMikdash? Tanakam is saying 2 curtains with 1 amma of space in between them. Rabbi Yossi is saying only 1 curtain. So says the Gemara, let's talk about that second machlokes just a moment. Shapir Kamar Luhu Rabbi Yossi the Rabbanon. So we'll say Rabbi Yossi is saying good, right? Because also remember again, Rabbi Yossi says there was only 1 curtain. Hainel was only 1 curtain because the pasuk says Vehivdila paroches lachem bein hakodesh kadoshim. The curtain, singular, will divide between the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKadosh. So what are you talking about? 2 curtains. There was 1 curtain. So what does the Rabbanon, what does the Tanakhama do with that pasuk? V'Rabbanon amri lecha hani mili b'mishkan. We'll say, when was there 1 curtain? There was 1 curtain in the Mishkan. Remember, we'll say that pasuk is by the Mishkan. Remember again, we also want to point out, does the Torah discuss the Beis HaMikdash? Right? Torah makes veiled reference to the Beis HaMikdash. Right? Tivi'imo v'sita imo bahar nachaloscha. Right? That we say in the Shira. That's reference ultimately again to the Beis HaMikdash. Another veiled reference to the Beis HaMikdash. But the only quote-unquote temple that the Torah discusses is the Mishkan. So the Torah goes out and says, so the Rabbanan will say, yes, you're correct, Rabbi Yossi, but that's the Mishkan. The Mishkan had 1 curtain. Listen to this. Ava mikdash sheni, kevan dalo havi amatraksin, oba mikdash rishon hu dahavi, v'istapku lahu l'Rabbanan bikdushase, ikilifnim, ikilachutz, so we'll say, okay, let's talk about this in just a moment, because this is really quite fascinating. So I'll say, here's what we have. In the Mishkan, there was 1 curtain. Okay. In the Mikdash Rishon, remember again, the Mikdash Rishon and the details of the Mikdash Rishon, of the first Beis HaMikdash, ultimately again were given to Shlomo Melech by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Right? The details, the dimensions, everything was given over by the Rebbeinu Shalom. In the first Beis HaMikdash, when you walked from the Kodesh into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, there was a wall. There was a wall in between the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKadoshim. The wall was 1 amma thick, and there was a curtain. And how did you go in from the Kodesh into the Kodesh HaKadoshim? You pulled the side or they pinned the side of the curtain, and you walked in. That's what happened. There was a 1 amma thick wall. So here was the problem. In the second Beis HaMikdash, Rabosai, the ceiling was much higher. So Rashi puts this out. So because the ceiling was much higher, they could not build a floor-to-ceiling wall that was 1 amma thick. In other words, that thickness was not enough to support the height of the wall. So what did they do instead? They hung a curtain. Now the problem was as follows. In the first Beis HaMikdash, you had an amma of thickness that was occupied by the wall. In the second Beis HaMikdash, that amma is there. What was the suffix? What was the status of that amma? Who does that amma belong to? Is that amma part of the Kodesh HaKadoshim? Or is that amma part of the Kodesh? Interesting, they didn't know. It's fascinating. They did not know how to categorize that amma. So what did they do? Essentially, I will say, how do they deal with it? By creating a double curtain system and essentially roping off that amma. So pretty much no one uses that amma, right? On a regular day, no one's traversing that amma. So whether it's part of the Kodesh, whether it's part of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the only time that amma is being used is when? On Yom Kippur for the Kohen Gadol to go in. That was it. So I will say, interestingly enough, this is the sheet of the Rabbana. So the Rabbana will say, yes, I agree in the Mishkan that ultimately, again, there was a curtain. That's fine, Rabbi Yossi. The pasuk according is by the Mishkan, right? But what the Rabbana says, Rabbi Yossi, what you're forgetting is like this, is that we have a fundamental architectural issue between Mikdash Rishon and Mikdash Sheni. Mikdash Rishon, that 1 amma of space was occupied by a wall. Mikdash Sheni, that wall is not there. So what do you do with the amma of space? That's what the Gemara says, Misapkiluhu, the Rabbanan were mesupak about the kedusha of the amma. Ikilifnim, ikilachutz. Is it like the Kodesh HaKadoshim? Is it like the Kodesh? Therefore, va'avid shtei parachas. So we'll say the easiest way to deal with it, and remember again, by the time we get to Mikdash Sheni, also we're dealing with a period where there's no longer any nevuah. So therefore, again, Allah Chalamaysa, the ability to ask Yibon Shalom, by the way, what should we do with this, was not there. And therefore, Allah Chalamaysa, the way they dealt with it was by essentially making it, we'll call it temple no man's land. You got it, you just simply demarcate, you rope it off. Double curtain system. We'll say fine. So that's the Machlokes, Rabbi Yossi and the Tanakama. Rabban Paskin is like the Tanakama. That Allah Chalamaysa, again, the 1 curtain system, it's true. I take it back. There was a 1 curtain system in the Mishkan and in the Mikdash Rishon. The double curtain system only comes really into effect when? Second Beis HaMikdash, and really as a way of just taking care of the suffix about what to do with the amma of space. Now I both say we get into an incredible machlokes. So I both say, now, the Brisa we're about to quote, remember, the Mishnah is very nondescript on how the Kohen Gadol got from the entranceway of the Beis HaMikdash into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, right? According to the Mishnah, it sounds like he just walked in. The Brisa is going to say that actually now there's a 3-way machlokes as to what route he took when he went from the entranceway of the Kodesh into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So here we go. Tan Rabbanon. So as Rabbi Yehuda holds that when the Kohen Gadol entered into the Beis HaMikdash, he took a specific route between the Mizbeach and the Menorah. So we'll say, if you look at this over here, so remember again, here you have, I don't know if you can see this over here, but you can see this on your own. So you have, if you're looking at your Beis HaMikdash diagram, that little square over here, like dead center, that's the Mizbeach, right? That's the Mizbeach. The menorah Bosai, is on the southern side, right? South over here. So remember again, this is east, west, north, south. So the menorah is on the southern side. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, when the Kohen Gadol would come in, the way he would walk was he would enter in and he would go in between the Mizbeach and the menorah. Rabbi say, we're going to see, let me just tell you this now, because it'll come up a little bit later on, but let's just say now. The machlokas regarding the route that the Kohen Gadol would take is dependent on which side of the curtain was open. We're going to see there's a machlokas. I'll just clarify one thing. We are going to adopt the double curtain approach of the Tanakama, which is obvious. Obviously, if you're having double curtains, what does that mean? The curtains did not run the full length. right? So the front curtain was open a little bit on one side, and the back curtain, the second curtain, was open a little bit on the other side. There's going to be a fundamental machlokes on the outer curtain. Was it open ultimately again on the northern side or the southern side? There's a machlokes about that. Depending on how you come out on that machlokes is going to determine the route ultimately that the Kohen Gadol took in when going into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So Rabbi Yehuda holds that when the Kohen Gadol would go in, he would go in between the Mizbeach and the Menorah. And you could see, this is reflected on the diagram you have in front of you, thereby indicating that the paroches, the curtain, was opened up on the southern side, the bottom southern side. That's Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Meir Omer, Ben Shulchan Mizbeach. Rabbi Meir said no, he would come in between the Shulchan and the Mizbeach. So also remember again, pretty much has him coming on the opposite side. Remember, the Shulchan is on the northern side. So Rabbi Meir says he comes in on the northern side between the Shulchan and the Mizbeach. V'yesh omrim bein Shulchan lekosel. And some say that ultimately, again, he came in between the Shulchan and the Kosel. We both say a third opinion, that he came in actually over here, hugging the wall between the Shulchan and the Kosel. The Kosel is the wall, Shulchan the Shulchan. So we'll say, so three machlokes, right? Rabbi Yehuda telling me he comes in on the southern side between the Mizbeach and the Menorah. Rabbi Meir telling me he comes in on the northern side between the Mizbeach and the Shulchan. And then the Yeshomrim also northern side, but extreme northern side between the Shulchan and the wall. Says the Gemara, by the way, Man Yeshomrim, who are the Yeshomrim? To which the Gemara says, Rav Chisda. First, the Gemara says, Amar Rav Chisda, Rabbi Yossi. It's ultimately, again, Rabbi Yossi who holds the Amar, Pischa B'tzafan. Rabbi Yossi holds that the entranceway of the curtain was on the northern side, and therefore you come in hugging the northern wall. So we'll have to stop over here for today, but we'll pick up again dramatic machlokes, and this machlokes is not only about how the Kohen Gadol entered in on Yom Kippur, but as we're going to see, it's the machlokes about the fundamental layout of the curtains of the Beis HaMikdash. Shkar Chabosai, we'll pick up here tomorrow, Mirat Hashem.